That night, for the first time in the 3 years she had occupied the chief executive chair of Vale Dynamics, Serafina Vale wept openly in front of her own board. The glowing red figure on the conference screen, a loss of $50 million, looked like a sentence handed down by some invisible judge, and the pen trembling in her hand hovered above the order that would sell off the last manufacturing division, capable of keeping the company alive. Inside the glass walls of the 39th floor, no one dared speak. They were only waiting for her signature so that by morning the markets would know Vale Dynamics had finally fallen. And then a single father pushing a records cart past the door paused, stared at the screen, and said quietly, as if he could not quite believe his own voice, "Ma'am, look at row 19. The 39th floor of Vale Dynamics Boston headquarters was never meant to be lit at that hour. Most nights the building dimmed after 11, and only a handful of service elevators hummed through the quiet glass tower. On this night, however, every lamp in the executive conference room burned, and the air inside had the dense, airless quality of a room in which bad news had been circulating for too long. George Whitmore, the company's chief financial officer, stood at the head of the long oak table with the kind of measured composure that made even catastrophic numbers sound procedural. He was a man past 40, silver at the temples, and his voice had the rhythm of a doctor declaring a cause of death. The quarter, he told them, had been catastrophic. Once all adjustments were accounted for, the corrected figure on the screen was final: a loss of $50 million. The only path left, he argued, was to accept the standing offer from a private investment fund that had expressed interest in acquiring the manufacturing division. Several board members did not bother softening their faces. A few exchanged glances that made no effort to conceal what they were thinking: that Serafina Vale was too young, too untested, to carry a company bleeding cash at that rate. One older member muttered that sentiment was no substitute for solvency. Serafina sat at the opposite end of the table. Her dark hair had been pinned back earlier in the evening, and now fell loose against the shoulder of her tailored dress. Her posture was the posture of a woman who had been trained since childhood not to flinch. She listened. She nodded at the right moments. She asked for clarification twice in a calm voice that gave nothing away. But when George mentioned the thousands of jobs that would have to be cut, and the manufacturing division her father had built with his own hands in the 1980s, something inside her chest folded. A single tear slid down her cheek and landed on the printed report in front of her. It was not theatrical. It was the quiet collapse of a person who had carried too much for too long. She wiped it away before anyone could see, but several of the older men looked politely at the table, as if courtesy required them to pretend not to notice. Out in the hallway, Flynn Archer pushed a records cart across the polished floor. He had been instructed to deliver a set of warehouse reconciliation documents to the administrative floor above. The doors to the conference room had not fully closed. As he passed, his eyes caught the report projected on the wall inside, and he stopped walking. Something on that screen was wrong. Not in a vague way. In a very specific, very concrete way that made the muscles between his shoulders tighten. He understood who he was inside this building. A night shift, records clerk, a man who was not supposed to exist above the 6th floor. He began to move again. Then he remembered his son, and he stopped a second time. When Serafina lifted the pen, Flynn opened the door. Every head in the room turned. George's smile did not move, but his eyes sharpened. "And you are, exactly?" George asked. "Someone who believes he understands this report better than my chief financial officer?" Hours earlier, before any of this had begun, Flynn had come home to an apartment that smelled of warm tomato sauce and pencil shavings. The building sat on the edge of a working-class neighborhood in South Boston, and the walls were thin enough that he could hear his neighbor's television through the kitchen. None of that bothered him. The apartment was clean, orderly, and warm, and inside it sat the one thing that had kept him standing for the past 4 years, a 6-year-old boy with dark hair and serious eyes named Leo. Leo had set the table without being asked, as he often did. He had even remembered to fold the napkins into small triangles, the way his mother had once taught him. Flynn looked at the triangles, swallowed once, and said nothing. Over dinner, Leo produced a piece of paper from under his plate. It was a maze drawn in crayon, careful and slightly crooked, and the boy explained it with the seriousness of a man presenting an engineering diagram. "One wrong square," Leo said, "and the entire path back home went wrong." Flynn laughed, ruffled his son's hair, and promised to try it after his shift. He did not yet know that the sentence would follow him through the night. Before his wife's death 4 years earlier, Flynn had been a promising undergraduate in operations analytics. He had been the kind of student professors remembered by name, the quiet one in the third row who always found the error in the case study the rest of the class missed. Then his wife had gotten sick, quickly, and then she had died, more quickly than anyone had warned them she might. Flynn had walked away from the program without finishing. Leo had been 2 years old. There had been no time for theory. He had taken the first steady job that offered health insurance. Night shift warehouse reconciliation at Veil Dynamics paid less than his former classmates now earned, but it kept the lights on and the pediatrician's bills paid. His work consisted of matching physical inventory against the company's internal records, flagging discrepancies in shipping documentation, and signing off on daily reconciliation logs. It was unglamorous work, but it had made him intimate with something no executive upstairs ever saw directly. He knew what the company actually looked like at the level of pallets and serial numbers, at the level of crates sitting in loading bays waiting for signatures. He had flagged small errors before. He had sent polite emails. He had learned, over time, that at Veil Dynamics the weight of a statement depended less on whether it was correct than on the chair occupied by the person making it. Standing in the hallway that night, looking at the screen, Flynn felt the same tight pulse he always felt when Leo handed him a maze with a wrong square. Arj's question hung in the air like smoke. Every head had turned toward the open door, and in that moment Flynn looked exactly like what he was, a man in a clean but worn shirt, a lanyard around his neck that read night operations, a records card behind him with one squeaky wheel. Serafina studied him for several seconds. Something in her recognized the look on his face, not panic, not pride, just the specific stillness of a person who has seen something he cannot unsee. "Let him speak," she said. The silence that followed was the kind that cost money. Flynn stepped into the room. He did not apologize for being there. He did not try to appear confident. He simply walked to the projected screen and pointed at a single line near the middle of the spreadsheet. "Row 19, he said. "It is in the wrong category." He spoke slowly, because he knew the room did not want to hear him slowly. He explained that row 19 represented a batch of completed industrial assets that were physically sitting in the company's main distribution warehouse, awaiting final delivery confirmation. He had personally signed off on their count the previous night. They were not missing. They were not damaged. They were not written off. But somewhere in the adjusted report, that same batch had been shifted into a category labeled recoverable value 0. That single misclassification, he explained, had propagated through 3 linked calculation sheets. The value of those assets, approximately $50 million, had been stripped out of current inventory and absorbed into the quarter's net loss. "If a shipment is still sitting in a warehouse waiting for a signature," Flynn said quietly, "it does not become worthless just because someone dragged the wrong cell." One of the board members, a woman in a charcoal blazer, leaned forward. "How certain are you?" Flynn reached into the folder on his cart and produced the physical inventory reconciliation log. His signature was at the bottom, dated less than 24 hours earlier. The lot number matched the line on the screen. George's smile remained in place, but the muscles around his eyes tightened. All adjustments went through 3 layers of approval, he said. I signed them myself. I am not disputing that they were approved, Flynn answered. I am saying that the categorization is wrong. Serafina turned to Henry Barlow, her chief internal auditor, a small, neat man who had been trying to keep up with the exchange. Pull the original source file, she said. Now. Pow. Henry opened his laptop with the stiff dignity of a man who did not expect to be taking instructions from a night clerk. For the first few minutes, his expression remained skeptical. Then, slowly, his face changed. Ed traced the formula chain across 3 tabs. Ed checked the mapping logic. Ed checked the history of manual overrides. When he finally looked up, his color had drained. The assets in row 19 are real, Henry said. They are in the warehouse. They were reclassified sometime in the last 6 business days. The reclassification is not consistent with any valuation policy we currently have on the books. The room went silent in a different way than before. This silence was not paralysis. It was the silence of a ship that had just noticed its own iceberg. If we had signed tonight, Henry said, we would have sold this company because of a single mislabeled row. Serafina stood. She did not raise her voice. She simply closed the door of the conference room herself, which in that building was an act nearly as strong as a scream. No one leaves, she said. No phones. No calls. Not until we understand what else in this report has been moved. Henry mobilized a small forensic team by internal line. Within 40 minutes, 2 additional auditors were upstairs, their shoes still wet from the freezing rain outside. They began pulling edit histories, access logs, override records, and system alert settings. What they found was quieter than outright fraud, and in some ways more disturbing. Several automated warning flags, the ones designed to alert senior leadership when asset categorizations shifted by unusual amounts, had been silenced weeks earlier. The justification in the system notes read reduce noise in the escalation queue. The approval for that silencing had been routed through a standardized operational channel that did not require a board-level signature, but the timing was suspicious. The warnings had been turned off only days before row 19 had been quietly reclassified. George continued to hold his ground. Even assuming, he said, that row 19 was an honest error, the broader liquidity picture of Vail Dynamics remained dire. Delaying the sale by even 1 business day could expose the company to a downgrade and a run on its credit lines. He spoke like a man offering medicine to people who were refusing to swallow it. Flynn listened without interrupting. When George finally paused, Flynn asked a single question that he had been turning over since the doors had first opened. If this company were truly beyond saving, he said, why is the buyer willing to close the deal in 1 night, at the pace of someone afraid we might sober up by morning? The question landed in the center of the table like a dropped coin. Serafina's eyes moved to George, and for the first time that night she looked at him the way a person looks at a hallway that has always seemed empty and might not be. She asked Henry to pull a separate stream of records, the email traffic connected to the acquisition. Henry hesitated. Then he did it. Among the pulled documents, one stood out. It was a message sent to a representative of the acquiring fund, detailing the exact structure of the assets to be divested. The timestamp sat 2 days before the current board meeting had officially been scheduled. The buyer had been walked through the carcass before the body had been declared dead. Serafina did not speak for a long moment. She was not only beginning to understand that she had almost signed away her father's company. She was beginning to understand that she had been steered there. The loss of $50 million was no longer what hurt most. What hurt most was the recognition that she had sat at the top of her own company without ever truly seeing it. Even with the discovery, Vail Dynamics was not safe. It was, in the grim language of restructuring, a company whose death certificate had been revised but not discarded. The banks would want answers. The rating agencies would want statements. And the markets would open in less than 6 hours. Matilda Valle, Serafina Sound, and one of the company's largest shareholders arrived at the office in a dark coat that smelled faintly of expensive perfume and winter air. She was 71 years old, composed in the way that only old money knows how to compose itself, and she had helped raise Serafina after the death of her parents. Whatever she was about to say, she would say it from a place of genuine love. She asked to speak with her niece alone. In the quiet of Serafina's office, Matilda laid out a position that was, in its own way, very reasonable. Fix the error internally, she said. Quietly. Revise the internal report. Do not give the press a reason to gorge. Perhaps still divest a smaller portion of the manufacturing division to settle the nerves of the board and buy time. Nobody outside this building ever needed to know. Darling, Matilda sighed, leadership is not about confessing every crack. It is about holding the house together. Serafina heard it. She even understood it. The instinct to protect the family name was not villainy. It was the logic of an entire generation. But she could feel another logic forming inside herself, one she could no longer unfeel. If she hid what had almost happened tonight, she would remain the kind of leader who could be steered. She would also become, in that single act, part of the exact silence that had nearly cost the company everything. She asked her assistant to bring Flynn back to her office. It was already past 3 in the morning. He came in looking more tired than he had allowed himself to look in front of the board. Serafina did not offer him coffee. She asked, bluntly, why he had opened his mouth tonight. He could have been fired on the spot. At the very least, he could have been quietly reassigned, demoted, harassed. Flynn thought for a moment. He answered more simply than she expected. If I had stayed quiet just to keep my job, he said, the people who would lose theirs tomorrow would be everyone else. Then he added the line that stayed in her for a long time afterward. This company did not almost fall because of one bad row. It almost fell because the people who notice problems first have been taught they are not allowed to speak. Serafina did not answer. She walked to the window and looked out at the city, where the first gray of early morning was pressing against the glass. In less than an hour, she would have to decide whether to walk into a press briefing and tell the truth, or whether to become, forever, the woman who had signed the wrong name onto the wrong form. Flynn drove home through streets that were just beginning to lighten. His car, an old sedan with a heater that worked only on the second highest setting, rattled over the wet pavement in a way that sounded almost companionable. He had not slept in close to 20 hours. The apartment was quiet when he unlocked the door. He expected to find Leo in bed, but the boy was asleep at the kitchen table, his cheek pressed against the page of a coloring book, one small hand still curled around a blue crayon. The overhead lamp made his hair look like soft feathers. Something inside Flynn gave. He bent down, slid his arms under his son, and lifted him carefully. Leo was stirred, his eyes opening just enough to register that it was his father. "Did you get in trouble?" Leo murmured, for saying the thing grown-ups did not want to hear. Flynn stopped in the middle of the hallway. A 6-year-old boy does not understand corporate finance. He does not understand board procedures, or quarterly adjustments, or acquisition timelines. And yet, lying half asleep in his father's arms, he had just described the entire night in 7 honest words. "No," Flynn said softly. "Nobody got mad at me." Leo nodded, satisfied. Then, as Flynn was about to lower him into his small bed, the boy reached up and pressed something into his hand. It was the crayon maze, folded carefully. "You missed 1 square earlier," Leo said, already drifting back toward sleep. Grown-ups do that sometimes. Flynn tucked him in. Hay stood in the doorway of the boys' room for a long time, the folded paper warming in his palm. Across the city, in a glass office 39 floors above the street, Serafina Vale had opened Flynn Archer's personnel file. She read every page. She read the record of 3 separate emails he had sent to middle managers over the past 2 years, each flagging what looked like small accounting or logistics inconsistencies. Each email had received a polite, dismissive reply. None of the flagged items had been investigated. All 3 had been closed out as noise. She leaned back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a long time. She understood, for perhaps the first time, something about her own company that no consultant had ever been able to articulate. Ballet Dynamics did not need to shout at people like Flynn to silence them. It only needed to make them invisible. She picked up her phone. "Call Flynn Archer," she told her assistant. "Before the press conference, I need him here." By the time the press briefing was scheduled to begin, the lobby of Vale Dynamics was flooded with reporters. Rumors had already begun to circulate. A crisis at Vale Dynamics. A possible sale. Camera operators stake out the side entrance. Microphones clustered on the short platform at the front of the atrium. Serafina stepped out at 8:30 in the morning. She wore a dark tailored dress, low-heeled shoes, and very little jewelry. Her makeup could not entirely hide the shadows under her eyes. Everyone in the room expected the same thing. Confirmation of the sale. A carefully hedged statement that would allow the stock to find a floor before the opening bell. She began with a steady voice. "Last night," she said, "Vale Dynamics came within minutes of executing a decision based on a financial report that contained serious and material errors." The murmur that rose in the lobby was immediate. Serafina did not raise her voice to override it. She let it settle on its own. She walked them through what she was willing to say. A critical misclassification had propagated through the adjusted quarterly numbers. The company's internal controls had failed to catch it. Automated alerts that should have flagged it had been suppressed. As a direct result, the board had been prepared to authorize the sale of a core manufacturing division at a valuation that did not reflect reality. She did not name George. Not publicly. Not yet. But she made no effort to hide behind him either. "As chief executive," she said, "I bear responsibility for the environment in which this happened. I have presided over a company in which voices outside the traditional chain of authority have not been valued highly enough to prevent avoidable harm." The questions began almost immediately, sharp and overlapping. Was this fraud? Was this incompetence? Were there resignations? Was the sale cancelled? Serafina answered what she could, and declined cleanly what she could not. She announced the formal suspension of the divestiture. She announced an independent investigation. She announced a full revaluation of the company's financial position. George tried, at one point, to step forward and soften the story. Evan with the phrase, "Let me provide some additional context. Mr. Whitmore," Serafina said calmly, without turning to look at him, "will have ample opportunity to speak during the investigation." A stopped. She ended the briefing with a line that would be quoted later in several industry publications. "The truth about what happened last night," she said, "did not come from the place in this building with the most authority. It came from someone this organization has not yet learned how to listen to." At the back of the atrium, partly hidden behind a column, Flynn stood with his hands in his pockets. He had not been introduced. What he felt, unexpectedly, was something he had not felt in any workplace for years. It was a small, unfamiliar ease, the ease of a person who, for once, was not being used as someone else's prop. After the reporters dispersed, George caught Serafina by the elbow at the edge of the platform. "You just saved your reputation," he said quietly. Now let us see how you save the company. The 48 hours that followed the press briefing were the hardest in Serafina's professional life. The company's stock opened shakier than it had been in a decade. Two major creditors demanded immediate conference calls. The acquiring fund issued a terse statement about reserving its legal options. Members of the board began taking private calls from their own counsel. Serafina did not have time to be afraid. She assembled a small, sealed working group. Henry, Flynn, herself. 3 people with 1 whiteboard, 2 laptops, and enough bad coffee to float a fishing boat. They rebuilt the picture of Veil Dynamics from the ground up, line by line, warehouse by warehouse. Flynn wrote in not the summary reports from the finance system, but the original physical reconciliation records, shipping manifests, handover signatures, and return dockets. Henry wrote the legal and audit machinery. Serafina held the pieces together and made decisions faster than she had ever made them. The pattern that emerged was not a clean, dramatic fraud. It was subtler. Row 19 was not an isolated accident. Several other categorization decisions, none of them individually catastrophic, had nudged the company's apparent financial condition in a consistent direction. Some automated controls had been quietly disabled. Certain projections had been presented in their worst plausible form at moments that favored urgency. The buyer on the other side of the proposed acquisition had been given structural information at points that should have been confidential. There was no single fingerprint on a single weapon. But when you laid the pieces side by side, it was hard to avoid the conclusion that George Whitmore had seen an opportunity in a fragile quarter and had chosen to accelerate it. During one particularly long night in the working room, Flynn paused in the middle of a column of numbers and looked at Serafina across the table. "Your company has been looking at itself from above for too long," he said. "The truth has been living on the warehouse floor, inside the delivery schedule, on the backs of things that do not speak for themselves." She held his gaze. For a moment she did not see a clerk, a subordinate, a helpful resource. She saw a man who was teaching her how to see her own life's work again. She nodded, once, and went back to the numbers. Flynn stole 8 minutes to call home. A kind neighbor, a retired school teacher who lived down the hall, had agreed to stay with Leo. He asked about oatmeal, about homework, about whether his son had remembered to brush his teeth. By the end of the second day, the working group had a defensible picture. The company was not healthy. But it was not dying. If its leadership could renegotiate a bridge credit facility and postpone any divestitures until a proper valuation was complete, Valley Dynamics could survive the quarter and stabilize. There was, however, one problem. The main lender had agreed to a final meeting only under one condition. The person who had first identified the misclassification would have to sit at the table and explain, in his own words, how the recovery model worked. No substitutes. No polished consultants. Serafina walked down the hallway to the small office where Flynn was working and stood in the doorway. "The bank wants to hear it from you," she said. Flynn set down his pen. "They want a night clerk to pitch them a recovery plan. They want the person who saw the truth." Flynn tried to refuse. Not loudly. He simply said he was not the right person. He did not own the right suit. He did not own any suit at all, in fact. He was not, he said, built for boardrooms. Serafina did not argue with any of that. She only said, "I do not need someone who looks like the answer. I need someone who understands the problem." The sentence went somewhere inside him that he had been defending for years. The night before the meeting, Flynn ironed the one pale blue shirt he owned that had not yet gone gray from too many washes. He borrowed a dark jacket from Henry, who, as it turned out, was exactly his size. He stood in front of his bathroom mirror for a long time and felt, not for the first time in his life, like an imposter about to walk into a room where he had not been invited. In the morning, Leon noticed the jacket. He did not quite recognize the man in it. He tilted his head. "Are you going to work?" the boy asked, in amaze today. "Something like that," Flynn said. Leo accepted this with a nod of great seriousness, and offered his father a solemn fist bump for luck. The meeting was held in a conference room on the top floor of the lender's downtown office, a room designed to remind visitors that they were not in charge. The lender's representatives did not hide their skepticism when Flynn was introduced. Their eyes moved from Serafina to him and back, searching for the joke. Flynn began with something no finance person had begun with in that room in years. It began with the warehouse. It described the physical flow of Veil Dynamics' manufacturing division. It described the pallet counts, the lot numbers, the actual presence of $50 million worth of completed goods awaiting transfer. It described them without sentimentality, the way a man who has actually walked through a warehouse in the middle of the night describes what he has seen. Then he walked them through the mislabeling. Then the silenced alerts. Then the acceleration of the proposed sale. He did not accuse anyone of anything. He simply laid the sequence out and allowed the listeners to draw their own lines. When the lender's senior representative asked a question Flynn could not confidently answer, he said so. "I do not know the refinancing covenants well enough to commit to that," he said. Serafina would be the right person to address that one. And he passed the microphone across. It was that moment, Serafina realized later, that changed the room. Nota virtuoso monologue. A man who was willing to say, in front of people with power, exactly which parts he did not yet understand. The bank did not fall in love with the company. What they agreed to, after 2 hours of hard questions, was a short-term bridge facility with strict conditions and frequent review. It was enough, barely, to keep Veil Dynamics from having to sell anything at a distressed valuation. Back at Veil Dynamics, Serafina asked Flynn to come to her office one more time. It was not the kind of summons he had feared for most of his life. It was something else. Her office was different in the afternoon light. The glass walls that had felt like a courtroom in the middle of the night now simply framed the city. She gestured for him to sit. He sat. She spoke plainly. She was forming a new internal group inside the company. Its working name was Operational Data Integrity. Its mandate was to reconcile the company's internal financial reporting against what actually happened on the warehouse floor, the factory floor, the loading dock. It would report directly to her office and be empowered to flag discrepancies before they ever reached the quarterly close. She wanted Flynn to help build it. He did not answer at first. He looked at his hands. "I do not want to be there because something happened to go right one night," he said finally. "I do not want to be somebody's story." "You will not be," she said. "You are not here because you were lucky. You are here because this system has been blind, and you are not." Then she did something more difficult for her than the offer. She apologized. Not an apology for the night shift, or for the missed emails, or even for the specific failures of row 19. She apologized for the culture that had made a man like him invisible for so long inside a company she was supposed to be leading. "I have been standing in the middle of my own company," she said, "without seeing how many good people have been taught to keep quiet." Flynn accepted the apology, the way he accepted most things, without performance, with a slight nod. From inside his folder, a single piece of paper slipped free and drifted to the floor. Serafina bent to pick it up. It was Leo's maze, creased from being carried in a jacket pocket across 2 long days. She turned it over absently. On the back, in his careful block letters, Leo had written a sentence in blue crayon. "Sometimes grown-ups miss the right square." She read it twice. And then, for the first time in what felt like years, Serafina Veil laughed. It was a surprised, gentle laugh, the kind that cracks a face that has forgotten how to bend. Flynn did not take the job that afternoon. He said he needed a day to talk to Leo about it. Serafina said that was exactly the right answer. When he left her office, neither of them said anything about the other thing that had quietly opened between them in the course of those 2 days. There had been no confession. There had been no music. There had only been 2 adults recognizing that they were no longer strangers. 3 months later, Ballet Dynamics closed its first post-crisis quarter. The numbers were not a fairy tale. The stock had not rocketed back to former highs. But the manufacturing division was intact. The bridge facility had been honored. The independent investigation had concluded, and its report had found no single smoking document, but a pattern of decisions significant enough for the board to quietly and unanimously request the resignation of its chief financial officer. George Whitmore left without a public statement. He did not need one. In the financial world, disappearance is often punishment enough. His departure was not dramatized inside the company. A note went out. The corner office on the 38th floor emptied over a weekend. His quiet loss of authority, after so many years of exercising it from behind polished procedure, was more than enough of an ending. Serafina instituted new practices that would have been inconceivable at Veil Dynamics 6 months earlier. She held monthly open review sessions in the main atrium, during which any employee at any level could flag process issues, data inconsistencies, or cultural concerns directly in front of senior leadership. Most months, the sessions were awkward. A few months, they revealed issues worth the embarrassment. Henry Barlow grew into the role he had always quietly deserved. He stopped drafting reports that could be interpreted in several safe directions. He started writing the ones he actually believed. Flynn accepted the role. He had talked to Leo. His son's verdict had been delivered at bedtime, with great solemnity and milk-stained seriousness. You should help them not miss squares, Dad. Flynn had not argued with that logic. He moved into a small office on the 12th floor. He kept his handwriting neat on his notebooks. He refused the larger title that Serafina offered at one point, explaining that he preferred to be the kind of person whose work got done before his business card caught up. At the request of multiple employees, a sign was installed on the wall of the main corridor in a simple sans serif font. If something feels wrong, say it. Toward the end of the quarter, Veil Dynamics held a small family day for employees. Children ran between cubicles. Parents carried cups of punch. Leo came with Flynn and spent most of the afternoon staring, wide-eyed, at the place where his father had once pushed a records cart past the doors of rooms he was not supposed to enter. Leo stopped in front of the sign. Harry read it slowly, syllable by syllable. Is this the company you saved, Dad? Flynn looked around at the people standing in clusters, engineers and accountants and warehouse supervisors and office clerks, all in the same open space, all talking to each other. No, he said. This is the company that learned how to save itself. Serafina was standing a few steps behind them. She heard it. She did not say anything. She only let the sentence settle, because it was the sentence she most needed to hear. Later that evening, as the lights of the building dimmed one by one, she walked past the old 39th floor conference room with Flynn beside her. Leo had run ahead, chasing a slow-moving balloon one of the staff had let loose. She paused by the glass. She saw, faintly, her own reflection overlaid on the empty room. Look at row 19, she said, softly. Flynn did not take his eyes off his son. It was not row 19 that saved the company, he said. It was the fact that you were finally willing to look again. She did not answer. She only walked beside him, at the same pace, down the corridor. The space between them was no longer the space between a chief executive and a night clerk. It was the space between two people who had survived something together, and who, perhaps, had just begun to find out what came next.